Welcome back. This is Joel Duff. An episode of Flood Geology Failures. This is where we take a trip to some geological formation, or in this case, some interesting fossils. And we just ask the question of ourselves, how could this be explained within a young Earth creationist flood geology model, wherein most of the geological formations of the Earth were formed within a short period of just a year, just 4,350 years ago? And so we're just looking at examples that just don't fit that scenario. And that's why I call them flood geology failures. And today we're going back to one of my favorite topics, fossilized feces, coprolites, the presence of fossil poop, and what that tells us about the development or the origin of different geological formations and sedimentary layers. And this time we're going to go way back to the Triassic. I'll call this piles of fossil poo, providing a peek into the past, because that's what we're doing. We're looking into the past. We're kind of asking ourselves, how long in the past? How would this have been preserved for us to see today? How would you preserve fossil feces? You know, a dinosaur dropping. How does that get preserved in the fossil record? There's a number of different ways, and we're going to see one pretty obvious way that can happen here with this particular example. This isn't actually going to be about dinosaurs. This is going to be about a large mega herbivore, probably one you've never heard of before. But let's dig into that. This has to do with this paper. I wrote a blog post on this, quite a few years back, and I was just reminded of this the other day. So that's why I thought, hey, let's talk about this giant prehistoric toilet that's been unearthed. And so there's some what just look like to be rocks, right, just laying on the surface. This is in Argentina. So how do we know that these are something more special than just some nodules? Well, you break open these nodules, or you cut them, thin slice them, look at them under a microscope, and you'll find that within those, there's a whole lot of plant material. This is just a big ball of plant material, a ball of digested plant material. That's your first clue as to like the nature, the origin of these little time capsules. Here's the paper this comes from, the oldest known communal latrine. Oldest known communal latrine. Communal latrine would be, well, it's a place where animals go to do their business, and they do it in a communal way, meaning that this is sort of like the location where they've all decided, like, here's where everybody's going to go. That way, there just isn't there isn't just a feces lying all over the place, right? You're collecting it in one location, and there can be some positive benefits to that for a group of herbivores or carnivores or whatever type of organism you're talking about. But you can probably think that there's not all animals do this, right? There's only certain types of animals or species that use a communal latrine, right? And the fact that there is a communal latrine suggests a type of behavior. So this is a case where we can look at a bunch of fossils, and from those fossils, we can infer behavior of the group or groups of individuals in that species. So in this case, it provides evidence of gregarianism. If you're going to use a communal latrine, then that means you're probably living together in groups, and which means you have some kind of social structure in those groups. But we're all the way back in the Triassic, and we're going to look at some mega herbivores. Now, there are dinosaurs in the Triassic, obviously. This is in the dinosaur age. But this is not thought to be dinosaurs. This is another mega herbivore. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. But we need to look at some pictures of fossilized feces, called fancy name coprolites. And so here's a whole bunch of these nodules of different sizes. They're thought to be 220 million years old. And what they're reporting in this paper is the first non-mammalian mega herbivore communal latrine from 8 massive coprolite accumulations. You see, reptiles don't use communal latrines, at least not that I remember or know of in the present. But here we have a non-mammal. So that's your first hint as to what kind of organism this is. We're not going to be talking about reptiles, and we're not talking about mammals either. So in northwest Argentina, There's defecation spots that are situated in the El Torcido locality and surrounding areas, and each latrine is composed of hundreds to thousands of in situ coprolites. In situ means in place, like these haven't been moved somewhere else. They haven't somehow been dislocated, picked up, eroded, and moved anywhere else by water or something like that. We think that where we're finding these coprolites is where the fossil feces was deposited and has been preserved at that particular location. And what are these assigned to? Well, they're assigned to the mega herbivore dicynodonts. Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Dicynodonts. We describe here the geological and sedimentary characteristics of this communal latrine-bearing areas, the general features of the latrines and the coprolites, the food habitats, because you can determine what they ate, because you can slice open the coprolite and actually identify the plant material inside. Social behavior and of the producer species. Defecation of dicynodonts in communal latrines reveals that this gregarious behavior is not unique to mammals and predates its previous oldest record. It's a little more of an idea of what we're looking at here. So in the upper left, you see an image of this desert environment with these hills. And on the side of these hills, out of this shaly material, is eroding out these nodules, which are coprolites. If they've rolled down a hill into a gully, then they're not in situ anymore, right? They're not in place. But they have locations where there's groupings of them that they see eroding out of the side of this hill, in which case they would identify all those were together or are together still at that time. And these coprolites are dense. I've mentioned in the past that there are hundreds of millions of fossil feces, right, in the fossil record, right? They're not uncommon. Don't get fooled on eBay about something being extraordinarily rare and therefore you must pay a high price for it. There's a lot of coprolites in the fossil record. And that is a challenge to young Earth creationists. Why is there coprolites like basically throughout the entire geological column? Well, actually not the entire geological column, because there are no large organisms, right? There are no vertebrates, in the lower third of the geological column. And guess what? Also, there aren't any large coprolites, especially herbivore coprolites, in which you see this structure of kind of like a cow pie, right? Just lots of herbaceous material inside. But here we have, in this particular locality, we have a very high density, right? 66.6 coprolites per square meter, reaching maximum densities of 94 coprolites per square meter. That's a whole lot of coprolites, right? That's why they're saying this is a communal latrine, lots of different animals. Think of something like rhinos. If you've ever been on a safari or gone to a place where there's a lot of large mammalian herbivores, you'll find that they tend to all go to some particular area in order to do their thing, right? And that is an effort to keep pests away, right? If there's parasites and insects and all kinds of stuff, right? You're going to stay away from that by depositing all together. Some estimates of 30,000 coprolites in some of the most abundant areas. So large piles. Now, what we're here for is to kind of think about, like, how would you explain this in a young Earth creationist view? Well, okay, so first I showed you, like, this is on the side of a hill. So those hills, which are eroding out of a large area in which that whole area was at once sedimentary rock. So this is all, and yet for young Earth creationists, all flood rocks. It was all deposited in a giant global flood. And yet here there are piles of poo, right? Piles of feces that are fossilized. How would you have a group of one type of organism all aggregating in one area and then all doing this in one to this extent, like this number? Either there was an enormous number of these organisms, and these must have been very large organisms since they have fairly large feces. So there must have been a lot of organisms all doing this all at the same time in order to make 30,000 coprolites. So what we have is, let me increase the level of difficulty for young Earth creationists. What we have a large number of coprolites. And how do they explain typically how you get like footprints in the middle of a flood? Because this is going to, you're stacking up thousands of feet of sediments over a period of a few weeks or maybe a few months. How do these animals happen to be living at this particular time? And put all their feces in one spot, right? You have to suggest that there was a lot of animals, all of the same species in this particular area, and maybe they're struggling in the floodwaters because they've got tens of thousands of feet of sediment below them, which has all been laid down in a large flood. So how did they get there? Were they floating around on vegetation mats? I mean, they were treading water for the last month. And then all of a sudden, like, as the tsunamis and things are going across the face of the earth, there's like a mud flat there. They're all running out in the middle of the mud flat and like, thank goodness, we can rest for a minute. And then, it's like, okay, well, let's all go to the bathroom. But, let's all go to the bathroom over here, right? We're not just like any old place, right? Except that there's multiple different locations in this particular area, all right, where there's multiple different latrines. That suggests an awful lot of animals. And since there's like 30,000 coprolites in some of these groupings, that represents a lot of animals that must have been present at one time, because creationists aren't going to say these animals are going to be there for months, right, or even days, right? Because this is a global flood. The whole earth is covered with water. So here's a cross section of several different units of this particular formation, geological formation. And this particular unit here is where there's actually multiple different fossils of a particular type of organism, this dicynodont. And in one portion of the formation is where we find a lot of these latrine bearing levels. And you might be like, well, why do we find these everywhere? Because I said there, coprolites are really, really common. Well, they're really common, but it's also true that just like footprints, most footprints that each of you and I make and all other animals that are alive today on Earth aren't going to become fossils someday. They're not going to be preserved for us. And that's the same way in the past. Animals that lived in the past are not going to have their footprints preserved very often. You got to have special conditions for that. Same thing with fossil feces, right? Bones. Yeah, there's a number of different ways you can preserve bones because they survive for a long time in the environment. But, fossil feces, right? They're going to decay. Other animals, beetles and so forth are interested in decomposing it and eating it and all that stuff, right? So it's just not going to lay there on the surface and wait around for thousands of years in order to get fossilized. Right? I could just hear young creationists say that. Actually, I have heard that, right? They're like, how could that get preserved without a global flood? Like it had to be covered up instantly in order for it to be preserved, and only a global flood could do that. The problem is this isn't actually, these weren't preserved. Many of these were not preserved by like sandy sediments. But these coprolites weren't preserved. Most of them weren't preserved in flood sediments. Some were. You can have local floods, right? You can be near a lakeside, and that's actually the environment here. It's kind of a lacustrine environment. There's lakes and swamps, and the animals are living there, and they have a common latrine, and then maybe the water rises, covers up that latrine, and then there's sediment in there, and the sediment kind of covers that up, right? So you can have a local situation where you actually cover these with sediments. Doesn't have to be a global catastrophe in order to preserve them relatively quickly. But that's not actually what's happened to some of the best looking coprolites in this situation. Many of these are preserved in, let me see here, by contrast, coprolites preserved within volcanogenic concretions. What you have large volcanic explosion, right? And you have a bunch of ash that falls, right? That's a great way to preserve stuff pretty much instantly, all right? Because the ash is a deterrent to like all the other kinds of decomposers that might be interested in decomposing that. And since it gets covered up, and ash also includes, chemicals that help preserve the things that it surrounds, right? Some of our best fossils are preserved very, very quickly, but preserved in volcanic ash layers. That raises another problem for young Earth creationists. Like, how do you get like thick ash layers, right? Volcanic glass. How does that get laid down in the middle of a flood? So if these were at the surface, the flood's going on, it's laying down lots and lots of layers of sedimentary rock, or sediments, which eventually become rock. And then you've got these animals that somehow get out on a mud flat, and they're surviving in the middle of the flood somehow. And there's many of them. And then they all decide that they are going to use a common latrine. And then volcano goes off somewhere, like in the middle of this flood, and then ash falls on them. And then somehow the floodwaters come up and don't erode that ash, but just deposit more material on top. That's a very contorted, explanation. Whereas an ancient Earth explanation is pretty straightforward, right? Kind of a flat plain, meandering streams, volcano goes off, huge amount of ash falls down, preserves lots of different stuff, right? And that stays there long enough that eventually, water, and that ash in that particular spot is there long enough, right? That maybe the next season's flood season, raises the water level in that whole area and you get a layer of sediments that get laid on top of all of that. And then you got mountains nearby. And so that sediment just keeps piling up on top of that. And that's how you get, the hundreds of feet of sediments that are rocks now that are above these common latrines. All right. So what about the organisms? Just a little bit about this particular organism, because that's also an interesting feature of the geological column, or in this case, the fossil record, is that we have entire groups, families, orders of organisms that these are not mammals. These are not reptiles. They're not birds, all right? And they're not amphibians. There's something else, right? The larger category, I believe it's called synapsids. I can't remember my exact phylogeny on all this stuff, but within synapsids, or the non-mammalian, all right, ancestors of mammals, one of those is called the Canamaiformes. So this is a large-bodied Triassic dicynodont. That would be the larger group, dicynodonts. And within the dicynodonts, there is a group of things. I don't know if it's a genus or a family within that, called the Canamaiformes. And chances are you're like, well, that's a weird looking organism. These have kind of a different hip structure than reptiles do, more mammal-like. But they don't have mammal-like features, like they don't have hair and mammary glands. And there's a bunch of features that are common to all mammals. So they have some of the mammal features, but not all of them. They have some reptilian-type features, but they're not reptiles based on other anatomical features. So there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species have been identified of these various non-mammalian large, mostly herbivores, that coexisted with the dinosaurs. I mean, dinosaurs get all the glory, right? Everyone talks about dinosaurs. Your kids can rattle off names of 50 different dinosaurs, and they get picture books and all that. And I mean, the dicynodonts, the synapsids in general, just don't get their fair share. They don't get the movies. They don't get, the plush toys or any of that stuff. Admittedly, a lot of them, if you go look up a lot of pictures of them, the recreations of what they could have looked like, they're just not that exotic. They're kind of like ugly, all right? At least in our, like, what we think is pretty. It's like, they're just kind of squatty, weird looking things. I mean, there are some really bizarre looking ones, so they're kind of intriguing that way. But the dicynodonts. And all of these are extinct, all of them. So that raises another flood. That's another flood geology failure, in that Answers in Genesis has like a list of, I can't remember now, it was 79, 78 different synapsid groups, synapsid kinds, right? Each of which has many, many different species, but they say that, all these species lived before the flood. And so they're all captured within the geological column. But they still had to be on the ark because they're still kinds. And since all the kinds, all the vertebrate kinds were on there. So they said like there's 78, I think it was 78 different synapsid kinds they list. They were all on the ark, so a pair of each one. And yet when they departed the ark, we don't have a record of any of them in the present. Right? These are all gone. I mean, the Triassic, hundreds of different species that aren't found anywhere above the Triassic. So that's another one of those things, like, why aren't there human fossils in the fossil record that are from the flood? Answers in Genesis has to answer that question. Why aren't there any sea reptiles? Why aren't there any dicynodonts? Why aren't there any pterosaurs, right? I have a whole nother video about how like 50% of all the different kinds of organisms that Noah preserved on the ark, according to Answers in Genesis and Young Earth Creationists, they all just instantly went extinct right after the ark. They were preserved on the ark, but they never survived after the ark, and they didn't leave any remains because we haven't found any remains of any of them in post-flood rocks. But I digress. More pictures of coprolites. And then you cut them open, right? And you cut them open, and these are all just little fragments of plants. These are close up, right? 200 micrometers. So here is a spore, right here. Lots of spores, lots of little pieces of plant material, vascular tissue. And in some cases, from the vascular tissue, you can tell what general kind of organism it is. And I can tell you what all these are. Well, actually, it's easier to tell you what they aren't. These are not flowering plants. Remember, there's 300,000 species of flowering plants today, right? Everything from grasses to orchids to palm trees to oak trees to, anything that produces a flower, right? All those are all the flowering plants. They're the dominant plant on Earth today. And yet, all of these particular coprolites, cutting them open and then trying to identify what they ate. These guys ate ferns, and they ate primitive gymnosperms. Gymnosperms like pine trees, spruce trees, ginkgos. I mean, these are all naked seeded plants that don't make flowers, right? And they're much farther down in the fossil record. They were the dominant form of, large plant at one point. And there's still a lot of them around today, but they've been usurped, in terms of their dominance by the angiosperms, the covered seed plants, which are the flowering plants. So that's interesting too, right? Here you have a whole bunch of these herbivores, which are presumably going around like, before the flood, eating plants, right? And now they're defecating during the flood. I don't know how they held it in that long, because they would have had to have like held it in for a month or two in order to have survived, in order to be able to lay it down at this particular place. That's a whole nother problem too, right? It's like, because they wouldn't have been eating, during this dramatic flood of the covering the whole Earth. And they're like, what are they doing? They're treading water or something like that. What, you're not going to defecate during that? I don't know. Doesn't make any sense to me. But like I said, we're just adding to the difficulty level here for Young Earth Creationists. What did they eat before the flood? Well, looking at their feces, this is physical evidence. These are the facts, right? Anybody who's good with their botany and their anatomy, right? Their gross anatomy of plants will be able to look at this material and tell you this is not flowering plant material. It has certain types, cell types in flowering plants that are not found in other groups. And these spores are spores. Remember, flowering plants don't make spores, they make pollen. And there's no pollen here, right? I'm sorry. There's no flowering plant pollen found here. We have 300,000 different species of plants, like there's pollen everywhere on the face of the earth today. And yet somehow they ate material but didn't eat any pollen. Pollen is like pretty much on every surface. And so you kind of can't help but eat anything today without kind of getting an herbivore. Can't really help but eat something. They're going to get some pollen in them, even if they're not eating a flowering plant. But somehow they avoided flowering plants. They avoided grass. They're like, nah, I don't want to eat that grass or anything like that. Right. I want to eat these tough ferns and I want to eat pine needles. Like that's what I want to eat. I'm sorry. Any organism that has a choice, large herbivore, doesn't choose to eat these really rough, difficult plants to eat, which don't seem to have been any juicier back then. So lots and lots and lots of plant spores, like fern spores, right? So eating ferns and other lycopsids, which is a mostly extinct group of plants. All right, so that's it. Just, another example of a location where you find fossil feces, and where you find the fossil feces, I didn't make this connection before, but where the fossil feces are found, that is where the remains, the physical remains of the bones of these Kennemeyerformes are. All right, these Dicynodonts. And so although there are dinosaurs alive at the time, and there are lots of dinosaur fossils in Argentina, in this particular formation and near these particular coprolites, we find dicynodonts. And that's why they're related to this material. Also, they're herbivores. There are herbivorous dinosaurs as well. But there is, I don't want to go into the details on this, but there is something about the shape of the coprolites themselves that has to do with, of course, the anus and so forth. And that also can be related to, this more mammaliform type organism versus dinosaur type organism. Even if these were from dinosaurs instead, which doesn't seem likely because we don't think that no reptiles today are gregarious and have common latrines. But that's not to say that there wasn't a species of dinosaur that's extinct that could have. Kind of doesn't matter for what I'm talking about here, though. Well, that's a kind of a cool behavioral thing. But even if you doubt that, you still have to explain how these fossil feces got where they got and how they got preserved. How could they have gotten preserved in volcanic ash that's right in the middle of a flood that's carrying around lots of other sediments? These are all things that make you go, it should make you go, if you're a young Earth creationist. You'll be like, yeah, how do I explain these features of the Earth? Because these aren't challenging. These aren't challenging fossils to somebody who believes the world's been around for millions of years and undergone many transitions and climate changes and so forth and experienced a lot of different organisms. All right, Flood Geology Failures. Let me know what you think. Thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging with me. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.